All right, so let's move on to our second special case. This is the perfect square trinomials, or PST for short. So let me remind you, I mentioned this a little bit in the first few videos. What does it look like? So when does a PST occur? So here's what you want to put in the blank down there in your notes. A perfect square trinomial occurs when the A and C are perfect squares. All right, so there's your A and C. So you're starting off in the beginning and the end with perfect squares. And this is a big and, the middle term is 2 times the product. All right, now how do I write 2 times the product? Just like this. 2 times the product. So here's what I'm saying. If my A and C are 5, let's say I multiply them together and I get 5, that means that your middle term should be a 10. All right? If my A and C, let's say I multiply them and I get 8. So if I take the first term, the second term, you know how you do, the last term, and you're setting up your X. If that top number in my X, let's say it's a 16, that means that my middle term, the bottom number that you would put in the X, would be a 32. So there's a relationship there that the middle term is twice your A times C. That's not always the case, rarely is the case, which is why we call this a special case, right? So that is when a perfect square trinomial occurs. Now, you still got to know your perfect squares. Because 9 times out of 10, if you recognize your perfect squares in the front and the back, the middle term is okay. So you got to know those perfect squares. Now, we want to know, how do we go from a perfect square trinomial and factor, okay? So here's what you put in your box. This is what you put in your box. Now, this is going to be a lot, so write small or don't write big or whatever. So here's what we got. If you start, so this is what your problem would look like, with a squared plus 2ac plus c squared. This is exactly what that first sentence says. I have perfect squares in the front, perfect squares in the back. Take the multiply, double it. That's what the numbers would be represented by this expression here. So if this is what you're starting with, then factor to get a plus c quantity squared. All right? A plus c quantity squared. All right? Now, what I need you to understand is that this plus sign will match this plus sign. So that's how you know that it's a plus. Go ahead and box those. All right? Box those. Second sentence in your box. We're still in the box. If you start with a squared minus 2 times ac plus c squared. So I'm going to take a moment, write that down, and then tell yourself what's the difference between what I wrote here and what I wrote here. Go ahead and tell yourself. Say it. What happened? Hopefully you'll say that the sign changed. The only thing that changed was the sign, right? Pay attention to that. So if this is what we start with, then you're going to factor to get a minus c quantity squared. A minus c. So here's what you need to understand. Perfect square in the front, perfect square in the back, doubled up in the middle. And if that's what you have, then when you factor, you will get either a plus c squared quantity squared or a minus c quantity squared. The sign in front of your B will be the sign in your answer. So this is what you should have in your box. And I know with the A's and the C's and all that, it's like, I don't know what you're doing or not or whatever. But when we come back to the next video, when you see these with real numbers, it'll make a little more sense. So fill this in. There is a pattern, but again, we're going to focus on the X box. Next